Everyone thinks the Black Dahlia case stayed unsolved. They're wrong, and the proof cost one man everything. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a mother and her daughter were walking through a vacant lot in Los Angeles. What they found wasn't treasure. It was the bisected body of a young woman, posed with surgical precision, her face beaten beyond recognition. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Within hours, the LAPD faced a decision that would define their entire operation: commit every resource to this single case, or treat it like the dozens of other unsolved murders stacking up across the city. They chose to go all in. That choice, made under pressure, with incomplete information, would shape the next 70 years. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She'd moved to LA in 1943, chasing the dream that lured thousands of young women to Hollywood every year. She was beautiful, charismatic, and according to everyone who knew her, she was broke. She lived in rooming houses, moved between addresses constantly, and survived on the goodwill of men she met in bars. The LAPD didn't know yet that this detail, her transience, her invisibility, would become the very thing that made her killer so difficult to find. By January 16th, the newspapers had a name and a photograph. By January 17th, they'd given her a nickname, the Black Dahlia. The term came from a 1946 film noir. It stuck because it was memorable, tragic, and it sold papers. The LAPD received over 1,000 tips in the first week alone. Each one had to be checked. Each one consumed man-hours, resources, and the kind of institutional patience that wears thin fast. The killer had made a critical error, or so they thought. The body was too clean, too surgically precise. The LAPD believed they were hunting a medical professional, a surgeon, or someone with anatomical training. They brought in every doctor in the city for questioning. They ran background checks. They cross-referenced with hospital records. None of it led anywhere. What they didn't understand yet was that the killer wasn't showing off medical knowledge. He was showing something else entirely. February 1947. The case had consumed the department. Every detective wanted a piece of it. The public was obsessed. Theories multiplied. A jealous lover, a pimp, a sadist with a torture fantasy, a gang initiation gone catastrophic. The LAPD followed each thread, knowing that one of them might lead somewhere. But the cost was mounting, not just in hours, but in the erosion of other cases, other victims, other families waiting for answers. Then came the confessions. More than 100 people walked into police stations claiming they'd killed Elizabeth Short. Some were seeking attention. Some were mentally unstable. Some genuinely believed they might have done it. The LAPD had to investigate each one. They had to measure each story against the forensic evidence. They had to eliminate them one by one. This was the cost of a high-profile case, not just the investigation, but the weight of false leads. By spring of 1947, the investigation had stalled. No arrests, no breakthroughs. The newspapers that had sensationalized the case began to turn on the LAPD, questioning their competence. The department faced a strategic choice: admit defeat publicly and redirect resources, or maintain the fiction of an active investigation while quietly moving on. They chose a middle path. They kept the case officially open but reduced the active team. Decades passed. The Black Dahlia case became a legend, a symbol of unsolved Hollywood mystery. Books were written, documentaries were made, armchair detectives obsessed over the details. But here's what most people didn't know. The LAPD never fully closed their investigation. They kept evidence. They maintained files. They understood something crucial, that sometimes a case doesn't get solved in the moment. Sometimes it gets solved when someone finally decides to look at old evidence with new eyes. In 2003, a retired LAPD detective named Steve Hodel made a decision. He was going to look at the case again, not as an official investigation, but as a personal project. He had access to files, connections, and decades of accumulated knowledge about how killers actually think. What he discovered was a name that had been in the original investigation file all along: his own father, Dr. George Hodel, a prominent physician, with a history of violence against women. George Hodel had been questioned in 1949. He'd passed a polygraph test, or so the record suggested. He'd been released. But Steve Hodel knew something the original detectives didn't. His father was a sociopath with the means, the knowledge, the opportunity, and the psychological profile to have committed the murder. George Hodel had access to surgical facilities. He had a history of abusing women. He had connections to the kind of criminal underworld where Elizabeth Short moved, but Steve Hodel couldn't prove it in court. The evidence was circumstantial. The polygraph from 1949 was unreliable by modern standards. Witnesses were dead. The case was too old, too cold, too legally compromised. What Steve Hodel had achieved was not a legal conviction. It was something else, a credible theory grounded in evidence that answered the question everyone had asked for 56 years. He published his findings in a book. The public read it. Some were convinced. Others remained skeptical. George Hodel died in 1999 before his son's investigation became public. He never faced charges. He never confessed. The case will likely never result in a formal prosecution. But the mystery, the thing that kept 70,000 people searching for answers, was solved. Not by the original LAPD decision to commit resources in 1947. Not by the confessions, the interrogations, the forensic work. It was solved by one man's decision to treat his own family history as evidence. The cost of the Black Dahlia investigation, measured in detective hours, institutional resources, and psychological weight on the department, never produced a conviction. But it produced something that matters just as much: clarity. A family got to understand what happened to their daughter. The public got an answer to a question that had haunted them for generations. And the LAPD learned that sometimes the right decision isn't to solve a case immediately. It's to keep it alive long enough for the truth to find its way out. Subscribe. New unsolved cases and cold case breakthroughs arrive every week. And some mysteries are waiting for the right person to look at them again.